Over to you, Dev.
Thank you, Alim. Good morning all, or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This session is going to be talking about stakeholder engagement and the tools and techniques that are typically used at each of the various stages of that engagement. Before we start, you should hopefully on your screen see a question about where are you joining us from. And if I may ask for you during the session, if you can go to menti.com, type in the code 524360 and enter the response on there. Then towards the end, we'll see where most of you have joined us from. Right, so let's see if I can get this thing working. Hopefully you can still see the map. Alim, can you confirm?
Yeah, all good.
Great, right. Next slide. So this is about engaging with stakeholders, and it's definitely not about managing them. I think a lot of people use the words, use one or the other word, but really this is about engagement, because engaging for me is about building relationships, it's about communicating, and it's about collaboration. Whereas management, for me, is more about, it is very depersonalizing, and I think that changes your attitude in how you're dealing with your stakeholders. Right. So, come on. Before we start, just a little bit about Kerry and myself. I'm joined by Kerry Marsh, who's a colleague from Australia. So while it's sort of almost midday for us, I think, Kerry, for you, it's late in the evening. So just a brief blurb about us, which you'll be able to pick up on the Slack channel, and also when we download this session. Right. So what's engagement and what's engaging with stakeholders all about? It is about communications. And this is about communication in as many ways as possible and as is necessary to develop an understanding and an acceptance of the initiative and its impact. And it's on all sides. It's not just about you transmitting information out to your stakeholders, but it's also about you receiving information from your stakeholders. It is about people, and it is about ensuring that it starts very early in the very early the early stages of a project. You'll have to excuse me. It's been a long day already for some of us, and we're all a little bit frazzled. But please bear with us as we go through the session. So it is about ensuring that engagement starts early. It happens often and regularly, and it should be strategic. It's not just about what you need to be saying now. It is about planning ahead, and it is about managing those risks that are likely to come up. So how do you preempt them before they actually come up? And that is by engaging with people, preparing them, and ensuring that they are ready for issues that do come up. Engagement is also should be tailored to fit the project. There are very many frameworks and methodologies out there, and one does not fit all. So it is about ensuring that you tailor your engagement to suit your project. And then it needs to be managed well. I did start off by saying that it is not management, but having said that, you do need to manage the engagement well. So have a plan in place, have the opportunities to review and update that plan, have milestones, have your KPIs in place. And finally, it is definitely an iterative process. You don't create a stakeholder engagement plan and leave it at that. That it is something that needs to be reviewed continuously and constantly, and you need to keep updating it because your stakeholders will change. Their views and opinions will change as the project progresses, and so you need to adapt your engagement strategy accordingly. Some of the key principles are that you can forget important stakeholders, but they won't forget you. Remember, you are talking about people, and people can be very vindictive in as much as they can be very supportive. So you need to make sure that you are keeping people on your side. And the way you do that is by ensuring that you identify who the stakeholders are. It is about prioritizing their needs, understanding what their understanding what they are all about, and making sure that they also understand what your project is all about. And the last two ones are very important. Emotion trumps reason. When you're facing a difficult stakeholder and you're putting all your reasoned arguments in front of them and they're still not coming round, well, that's where the emotion bit comes in. And so you need to deal with them emotionally rather than through reason. And then finally, demonstration trumps argument. Yeah, and that's one of the key elements of communication. If you can show something working, if you can show something rather than talking about it, that's certainly going to create a lot of good vibes. Let me just stop that. Yeah, okay. Moving on. So, as I mentioned, there are very many models and frameworks out there on how to manage stakeholders, and they all essentially say the same 5 things. One is you need to identify who your stakeholders are. You then need to understand what their needs are, what their views are, what their opinions are. Having done that, you then build your strategy around those views and opinions. How are they going to influence your project? How are they going to integrate with the work that you're doing? How will they receive your project? And all of that is going to be forming part of your strategy. It is then about communicating with them, and communications should be open, often. In fact, you should be communicating all of the time. Because if you're not communicating, that means they're not understanding and they're not keeping up to speed with what's going on. And when you do need their support for something and they're not on the same side as you, or they haven't kept up with what's going on, that's when a lot of the issues arise. And then finally, it is about continuously reviewing and assessing what needs to be done. So we mentioned 5 stages, and the first stage is identifying your stakeholders. So who are your stakeholders? Well, certainly it's the people involved. And this means that even if you're talking about groups or departments or organizations, at the end of the day, it is still all about people. And all stakeholders that you can come up with are important. Some just need more engagement than others. And also, you can't engage with everybody. So you need to identify key people to engage with. And here's a list of some of the key stakeholders that you would typically be dealing with. You'll be dealing with your sponsor, your board members, the recipients and users of the service that you're delivering, or the change that you're delivering, your delivery team. I mean, they're the ones involved in actually delivering what you're putting out there. So we shouldn't forget how to engage with them and look at what their views and opinions are. And also yourself. You are a stakeholder. If you're involved in that project, your opinions should matter as well. And then, of course, let's not forget that it is an iterative process. Now, at this stage, there are so many different types of tools and techniques that you could use. And through this session, we are going to talk about a few of those tools and techniques in a little bit more detail. We are limited by time, so bear with us. But we can come back and review these if you have particular questions about some of the tools and techniques we've used. So at this point, there are 3 main tools and techniques that we would recommend. Lessons learned, brainstorming, and pestle. We'll try and talk through those as we go along. Okay, so lessons learned is usually about reviewing what worked and what hasn't worked in previous initiatives. But this technique is also very useful for identifying who the stakeholders are and should be, because you can look at the previous stakeholders, you can understand who was involved at what on which projects. You can look at the races of previous projects as well as the communications plans, and using analysis understand which one of those people are going to be key to your own project. It's also a good way of understanding perspectives of those key stakeholders that are listed there, and identifying how and when they have contributed to the various projects. What else do we want to say on this? Kerry, do you have anything else to add to this on this slide?
No, I think everybody has got that one covered relatively well. So lessons learned is also done at the very start of what we do, and then embedded all the way in. It enables us to have that continual improvement, that continual feedback loop into everything that we do there.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, next one is brainstorming. And this is a method that many of you will already be familiar with. It is a way for teams and groups to generate ideas and solve problems. In this case, we're talking about identifying stakeholders. Different flavors of brainstorming. You've got your brain writing, rapid ideation or rapid listing, brain netting, which are effectively all the same thing, which is individuals produce ideas and either put them up on a wall or discuss them or send them through over the internet, which is what brain netting is all about. It's really just about an electronic means of communication, and share those ideas. Things like round robin is where people are sit in a circle, and each one has an opportunity to say, to either name a stakeholder and explain why that person is important to the project, and that way you then collect information about your stakeholders. Something like six hats is a variation of starbursting, which is essentially you ask some very obvious questions like who, what, why, where, when, and how, and everyone has an opportunity to actually respond to each of those questions as you go through the session. Kerry, would you like to add anything at this point?
No, all good.
Okay, you might as well stay unmuted, Kerry, and chip in as we go through.
Am I up next, am I?
I think you are as well. Okay, the next one is pestle analysis. Go ahead, Kerry.
I'll even put my video on. Hello, everyone. So pestle analysis, some people may be familiar with through marketing, and pestle analysis actually that enables us to look at stakeholders in terms of our wider or far environment for our organization. It does quite literally stand for who are our political stakeholders, who are our economical stakeholders, the societal, technological, legal, and environment or ecological there, that depending on the viewpoint of what it is that you are looking at. So it just enables us to see where our organization is in the marketplace that it operates in. So it's looking at the further reaches, and we typically will couple a pestle analysis with other forms of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder analysis as well. So this is just a hierarchical view.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Before we go to the next section, I have another question for you. Again, if you go on to your beg your pardon. No, I think there's something gone wrong. Just bear with me. Right, there you go. So how have you previously engaged with your stakeholders is the question. So if you could go to Menti again and type in the code 524360 and ask the question, we can then review what your responses have been like. Right, so understanding your stakeholders. And this one is, and I have lost my link, there we go. This often happens at the same time as identifying your stakeholders. And it is about understanding what their influence is on the project, what their interests are, how they can contribute to the project, and what power they have. You could have your senior stakeholders who typically like your board members who would have an enormous amount of power. But equally, a user or a user group would have a significant amount of power. They may be quite low down on the level of importance, but the power that they're able to affect on your project by simply refusing to work with what you're delivering can be quite significant. So it is about understanding how and where they are. The techniques we've talked about earlier, lessons learned, brainstorming, and pestle, are equally applicable here. but we're also going to now touch on power and influence matrix, the stakeholder profile, and empathy maps and personas. I think everyone will be familiar with this matrix, and it is about understanding where in a power interest curve do people sit and stand. High power, high interest players, high interest people are typically in your top right quadrant, and they are your key players. They're the people who you really need to keep close and manage very closely. And it could be argued that people in the bottom left corner are ones who just need to be kept updated with what's going on, and not much effort needs to be spent on them. Color coding is really quite helpful because it gives you a visual view immediately of where people are. In this instance, for example, we're using red to indicate people who are not in favor of the project or who are detractors of the project. Green to say to talk about people who are for the project, and yellow for those who are neutral. They really don't. It's really not in their interest to worry about whether the project is successful or not. I think that covers everything I want to say on this one. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Deb. So when we have identified our stakeholders, the next step is actually to do a little bit of profiling about them. So we seek to understand, in terms of our change, what is the impact that they are going to have, so that we can develop strategies to enable us to actually maintain that relationship with our stakeholders. And you can add to this information. So this is just a hierarchical view. We look specifically at who the stakeholder is, the date of the initial assessment. So bear in mind is that this is iterative. We will need to come back and look at the assessment again at various intervals throughout the life cycle of our change. We look at the benefits and as well as the disbenefits. If there is any resistance, we can capture that resistance there, and it enables us to build those strategies to actually develop a way of working with that particular stakeholder to reduce the resistance to our change. We have the dates of when we contact our stakeholders, and if there's anything special that we actually need to understand about this particular stakeholder. You'll also see at the bottom there is underneath next steps, there is a current and target, and that is referring to the position towards the change, whether they are for our change or whether they are against our change. And of course, if our stakeholders are anti or neutral, we can then develop strategies in terms of their engagement to promote them into that target of being on board for our particular initiative. We can also include that in terms of our strategy for that actual communications for their preferences.
Thanks, Kerry. Sorry I interrupted you.
I've got my stopwatch on, so I'm timing myself there.
Okay, sorry, that's something that happened there. Right, so the next one is personas, and you can carry on.
Personas are another good tool that we use when we're thinking about our stakeholders. So we will typically use them to either categorize a wide range of stakeholders. So for example, if you're going out to new product development and you want to market launch something, we are actually looking at a particular group of people and we actually give them a persona. So it helps us to understand more about what is happening in that particular group's life. I'm going to flick over to the next slide.
Sure.
And in turn, that enables us to actually look at that empathy mapping. So we're thinking about a stakeholder or a group of stakeholders, and we're thinking about what they actually think and feel, what they hear, what they see, what they do, their areas of pains and gains. And we can in turn, particularly for our internal change initiatives, we can actually look at that from an internal way of working.
Okay, thank you. Move forward. Just bear with me. It's amazing how technology always stumps you. Okay, And then this is looking at developing your engagement strategy. So you've got all of this information, you've built up pictures of who your stakeholders are, you know what you need to do with them. What do you do with them? And so you create a stakeholder engagement strategy, or a stakeholder plan, or even sometimes it's called a comms plan. But essentially it is about understanding and collating all of this information into a document that can be shared with other members of the team, or indeed when you as a project manager, if this is your project, have gone on holiday, how will the person who's replacing you know what you've done, what your plans are, and how you've been working on them. And that's where your strategy comes into it. Again, we'll talk about a few more tools and techniques, and let's go ahead. Kerry, I think this is yours as well.
Yeah, it is indeed. So stakeholder segmentation, and this is where we're actually looking at how we might communicate. So we can actually group, quite literally, our various stakeholders onto a map, which we segment. So customer, provider, though that could be your actual supplier as well, your influencing groups and your governance stakeholders. And then we actually map them onto a radar so that we can communicate depending on where they sit in that radar given point in time. So in the very center, we have vital to engage, which means that we need to keep them engaged continually. Necessary to engage, good to have engaged, and courtesy to inform. So you would actually then cross-reference back to that power, influence, and interest matrix as well, as people's needs will actually change over a period of time.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is an engagement matrix, and Kerry referred to it earlier. I think she used C and T, which is current and target, whereas in this one we're talking about C and D, which is desired level of engagement. And you typically try and map your stakeholders in falling into one of 5 categories. Unaware, which is the U up here, R, which is resistant, neutral, supportive, or leading. And this is just an example of one way of demonstrating an engagement matrix. So you'll probably have your own terminology around this. And essentially what this allows you to do is to identify the amount of effort required to actually move people from one stage to another, and whether you do need to move them to that stage. And it's a good way of keeping up to speed with what's going on, because as their perceptions change, then so will this document. Kerry, you just want to touch on this briefly, because we'll come back to this one as well in a bit.
So always have a good look around the internet for a lot of tools, and this is one that actually came via LinkedIn, and this one is quite literally a communications plan on a page. So we can dovetail this into pretty much everything that we do. It's got our stakeholder influence interest matrix, it's got our measurements, how we're going to measure those key messages, what the objectives are. So it is really an all-encompassing, nice A3 size piece of paper to work from. And at the bottom of the screen there, you might not be able to quite see it, but the actual activity itself that needs to take place, who the audience are, how we're going to do that activity, the lead's name, and the when. So it's a really, really good, simple tool that can be used. And I see a lot of these ones popping up all over the place now.
Okay, thank you for that. So I asked a question earlier about how have you previously engaged with stakeholders. So let's see if we can go and have a look at the response. So voting is closed. Great. And see. Right. So emails. A lot of you are saying emails is the way you correspond with your stakeholders. Phone, regular meetings is another one. But I think we can see clearly here that emails is what a lot of people use. Now, how does that compare with what we are going to suggest and recommend? Let's have a look. Oh, surprise, surprise. Communications with your stakeholders is not just about emails. And here's a flavor of the various alternative ways of engaging with your stakeholders. The starting point of all of this is ask your stakeholder how you should communicate with them, because everyone has a different way of receiving information. Some people are very visual, so they like graphs and colorful pictures. Other people like narratives and they like reading reports, etc. Others just like verbal updates. So you need to identify, especially with the key stakeholders, what is it that you need to do to engage with them, and add that information to your comms plan, which you've already looked at. So it is about transmitting information, which is giving, spreading that information out. It is about receiving information back from your stakeholders. And then it is also an element of collaboration that's going to be required. But the key point here, it is not just about emails. If what you've been doing is sending emails, that's not the thing to do. Look at and consider all of these other alternative ways of communicating with your stakeholders. And this diagram, I think I find particularly useful because it is about that power influence matrix that we spoke about earlier, that everyone's very familiar with. And here are examples of the kinds of communication you can do in each of those quadrants. So with those people that you are keeping close and wanting to work together in the top right sector, it is about things like producing documents together. It is about working together, writing together, looking at risk registers. And then if you look at what you need to do on the bottom left, public web pages, basic information that you're sharing that is more about transmitting and broadcasting rather than anything else. And then different other other methods that you use in each of the other sections. So this is something I found very, very useful and hope you do too. Again, we touched on this earlier. I don't know whether you want to add anything more to this, Kerry?
I don't think there's any more to add on it, but I've certainly seen a few questions, though we might come back to that slide during the Q&A section,
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. Right, your stakeholder engagement plan. So we've got your strategy, you've got your stakeholder engagement plan, which also in this instance is the comms plan. And again, I don't think I'm going to spend very long on this. Oops, not what I wanted to do. I'm not going to spend a very long time on this because Kerry has already spoken about the comms plan on a page, and I'm sure you'll all have some more questions. But as a rule, it is about having your key stakeholders on there, how you're going to be communicating with people, the different types of communications you'll be using, some of the key messages that you need to get out for individual stakeholders. So there might be different types of messages you want to send out to different people depending on whether they're for or against a project. And then ultimately, what are your goals? What is it that you're trying to achieve? If you're rolling out a piece of software, new software, it is about ensuring that the training is in place. It is also about ensuring that people know what's coming their way, are ready for it, etc., etc. I think I will move on. And then finally, it is about reviewing and assessment. It is about measuring your results, understanding whether you've achieved your objectives. And if you aren't satisfied, making the necessary adjustments in order to perform better the next time. We mentioned previously that this is a cyclical and iterative process. So how do you know you want to improve something without being able to measure it? And so here are some of the key questions you could ask about the comms that you're engaged in, depending on which method you're using. Has your audience received it? Have they understood what you're trying to say? And have they bought into and received your messages? And it is also about that constant review, update, and change, because you will need to change your methods depending on the stage of the project you're in, depending on how your stakeholders are feeling on that particular day or that particular period of time, because there may be other change initiatives that are impacting on them as well, and that might have that will all influence how you produce your communications and how you actually provide them. And that's it. Questions?
Great, thanks, Dev. We do have quite a few questions that have come in the chat. So let me just get to them. And then we will also give people an opportunity to ask questions verbally. So thank you all for your questions. Let's start with, actually, before we start, so let me use this as the opportunity to get everyone to turn on their video cameras, as I mentioned, and just give us a wave. So just to kind of warm everyone up before we get into the Q&A, so turn your cameras on, give us a wave. You'll be made famous and all that stuff, I promise. Thank you. Thank you for you.
He's only joking.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all. So, okay, back to the serious stuff then. Okay, so we have about 8 questions, I think, as things stand, and obviously more will come in. So the first one, Dev and Kerry, how do we ensure that we haven't missed some critical stakeholder in this process?
That is definitely not an easy question to answer. And it's one of the reasons why we actually utilize existing stakeholders that we know to actually provide us that check and balance. So we can go to other stakeholders and actually check our list of stakeholders with them. They're the best people to tell us if we might have missed somebody important as well. And of course, bearing in mind, my change manager hat on, is that all your stakeholders are important, okay? Some just happen to be more important than others. So if in doubt, check with those other stakeholders.
And also, this is an iterative process. So if you miss a stakeholder in the first instance, and you will be reviewing this on a regular and often basis. So hopefully it won't be a big issue, and you'll be able to pick them up later on. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So if so, I'll keep moving us on. So
yeah, sure.
Answer it for me. But if the person who asked that question wants to follow up with a subsequent question around that or someone else, then as I said, I'll get to everyone. I'll give you all a chance to ask verbally as well. But otherwise, I'll move us on. So thank you both. So next question: how does this fit alongside change management? And I think it was on one of the earlier slides. Deb, so it might give some context. I don't remember what the context for this was, but if the person who asked, if they want to add more context, please do. But how does this fit alongside change management?
It sits very well. I mean, this is all part of any initiative, whether it's a project to deliver systems, software, or to implement change. It is about communicating, and it is about engaging with stakeholders. So unless whoever asked the question wants to add a bit more context so we understand what difficulty is, I would say it fits very well with any change that you're doing.
So I'll just add an extra bit of context for Linda there as well. So Linda, from a change management perspective, it's actually an integral part of change management. There is often a misconception that change management isn't really a lot to do with stakeholder engagement. But the reality is it's everything to do with that change management and stakeholder engagement. So the two go hand in hand. It's a core part of what we do in change management.
Yeah. And Dev, I think it was, as I said, one of the earlier slides, but I think Kerry's answered it anyway in that, and we would have seen later on with your subsequent slides that actually a lot of it is to do with change management. So I think that was answered anyway by Kerry and the slides that you covered afterwards, but the person can follow up if they need to. Let me move us on. So this is a good one. How do you engage with a key stakeholder that refuses to engage? What techniques do you have there?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I think we've all faced that situation. Well, sometimes you use other stakeholders to engage with stakeholders. So, for example, there was an occasion where I had a director who was refusing to engage with a project that I was working on, even though his directorate was going to be significantly impacted by whatever we delivered. Despite different types of approaches, he just was not engaging. He was always too busy. And obviously there was something that he wasn't too happy about. So I went to my sponsor and engaged the sponsor and said, I've tried to engage with him, I'm not getting anywhere, perhaps you can. And sure enough, my sponsor was able to engage with this director, and it really turned out to be something very, very minor, that the director wanted someone at his level to approach him about this first, rather than being approached by someone who he considered was junior and didn't want to get involved in the nuts and bolts of what we were doing, even though it wasn't a nuts and bolts issue. So that's one way of engaging with people who refuse to engage, is use other people to engage with them. Kerry?
Yes, so Kelly, that is actually one of the principles that was on one of the earlier slides, is that some stakeholders are best engaged by others for that very reason. So we see change managers at various different levels in our organization, and we like to maintain at least partly the status quo in our organization. So those conduits of communications that they're actually used to, they're quite helpful to us. And of course, worst case scenario, take them to lunch. Yeah?
Yes, if they'll have lunch
works.
with you.
Yeah?
If
that
they'll have lunch
always
with you.
works. Find out what they like to eat and take them to lunch.
Yes. Next
Or
question.
jewelry, I guess. Jewelry, bribes, brown bags.
Okay.
No, the lunch does it every time.
All right, all right. So, look, many of the other questions that I'm going to keep asking were around your stakeholder map. You know, how do you engage, etc. So, before I ask some of these other questions as well, let me see if there's anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question directly. Is anyone wanting to ask a question directly to Dev and Kerry? Please unmute yourself and do. Otherwise, I'll continue asking the questions through the chat.
Hi, yes, Karthik here. I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I don't quite get, why do we need to have the empathy mapping? So if someone can explain it, it would be great.
So it's a useful tool when we can't actually engage directly with stakeholders. It just helps us to understand a little bit about a stakeholder group that we can't directly engage with for any reason. So, you know, when I used to work in new product development, a lot of what you do in new product development is very hush-hush. And we might actually need to think about how that product is going to sit in the marketplace. So we do that by creating personas. If you look at politicians as another good example, yeah, they target their audience because they have actually created a persona and they target their messages directly to that particular audience. It's just a good way to help us understand more about a group of stakeholders. So creating a persona gives them that look and feel of real people.
And Karthik, also, the tools that we're showing here are not necessarily tools that you should use all of them of. It is a recommendation of some tools that we've seen that have worked in the past. So you're right. For some projects, empathy mapping might not be appropriate. This is where you use your judgment and your experience to decide whether you can do this or not. Hope that's answered your question.
Oh yeah, I think you answered my follow-up question as well.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
That's good. Great. Anyone else want to just ask a question verbally before I go back to the chat? Meghana?
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Meghana here. I have a question. If you discover one of your key stakeholder discovers few unethical practices he is engaged in, then how do you handle this situation? And how should you communicate this to the other people on your team as well as other stakeholders?
Great question. So
That's
whistleblowers, how do you handle unethical practices? Great question.
Well, it's how would you handle unethical practices in any scenario? You need to understand, and I would say you need to obviously engage with your in the first instance your sponsors or your senior managers, so that you get them to advise you, perhaps offline, and say, look, I know of a situation where something has happened, and this is the scenario. What would you advise I do? If it's something that you think you can knock on the head by having a conversation with that person directly, then all the better. But if it's not, and it's going to definitely have an impact on your project, then you definitely do need to raise the issue and the concern with the appropriate people. You need to be a bit circumspect as well, and like I said, perhaps just raise it with one or two of your senior managers in the first instance, and then and see what their advice is.
Okay.
And Megana, I would add into that you know, you should also be checking any HR policies, because most organisations will have some sort of HR policy which will determine the course of action that needs to be taken when unethical behaviour is in fact uncovered. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Megana. Okay, let me go back to the chat, and we'll have a chance to go back to the verbal questioning again after. Okay, so the next question, as I mentioned earlier, Dev and Kerry, you know, a few around stakeholder engagement. So the first one being, do we really need to gather so much of the detail for each of the stakeholders? Because Dev, you presented, you know, quite a lot of detail for different stakeholders,
Sure.
and I guess the question's being asked, is that overkill?
For some projects, it could be, absolutely. And it is about making sure that, let's see if I can find that information. Again, this is where your judgment and experience comes into play. If it's a smaller project, then you might just want to group your stakeholders into groups and categorize them in groups and deal with them in that way. But certainly, the more you know about a stakeholder, the better you'll be able to engage with them. So even for some of the smaller projects that are going to have a high impact on an organization, then you certainly do want to make sure that whoever is receiving the output from the project, you are able to engage and communicate with them as well as you can. So we've provided these tools and techniques. They're there in an advisory capacity, and they're there as recommendations. But again, you don't have to fill in every single box, and you don't have to fill in all that information. Just use your judgment about how much information do you want to collect. And if you find that having collected certain information, your communications aren't getting through, go back and review. That's what that constant review is about. Go back and have a look and say, well, okay, what more do I need to know for me to get the message across? Or how else do I need to do? So it is an iterative process. It is a learning process.
Okay, thanks, Dev. And the next one, I think, comes up quite often when this topic is being discussed. It has on every forum, every meeting I've been involved in, and it's to do with the confidentiality and the sensitivity of the data you're capturing. So what if it gets in the wrong hands? What if you're putting, you know, different people in the wrong categories? So essentially, where do you store the data? Do you share it with everyone? And what happens if there were repercussions? How do you deal with it?
So I think I'm sure Carrie has a view as well. So I'll let her go first.
So obviously, one thing that we don't do with our stakeholder profiles and our stakeholder matrix, particularly the profiles, is they are for use for your change managers and your project and program managers alone. You know, we're not going to go sharing them with anybody else. So it is actually quite personal, and it depends on how much information you store. Sometimes you might actually have proper contact information about those stakeholders. So it is worthwhile to note any privacy policies and data protection policies that you have in place in your organization. They do still need to be adhered to. But something that we don't do is we don't actually go sharing that information with other stakeholders. So obviously, as part of collaboration from the very outset, you can stylize your communications to specific stakeholder groups. So as an example, if you're working with unions, and I hope that there might be some union reps on here, but maybe not. If you're working with unions, there is typically information internally to a company that you don't want union members actually seeing or union representatives seeing. So you can actually stylize those stakeholder group sessions to enable you to maintain that confidentiality of the information. That is just a technique. I'm actually an advocate for making sure that if I do have a change initiative or a project or a program that will in some likelihood have union involvement or interest, I actually always bring them along for the journey from the start to the finish, because it's the best way to know that what we are doing is actually then going to be representing interests long term. Over to you, Dev.
Thank you. Those of you who have seen some of my other presentations will know that I'm a great proponent for transparency in projects, and I agree with what Kerry has said. On the other hand, it is a case of saying, well, any project information should be available to anyone who wants to see it. Having said that, absolutely, data protection and certain information cannot be shared with everybody. Having said all that, I think the information you collect on these profiles should also not be too personal. It is important to know who those people are. It is important to know what their views and opinions are. It is important to record how they've engaged with you, but you don't need to go down to putting insults or opinions on there that could be construed unfavorably by the person you're talking about if they get to see that. So it is about maintaining that distance and professional distance from the person, and ensuring that the information you're collecting is to the point, allows you to do your work, but doesn't necessarily personalize it to that extent. Hope that helps.
Thanks, then. And look, just to bring a light-hearted comment to this, so I've been watching a series called Narcos recently. It's all about Pablo Escobar and all different gangsters. So where they do have information about some of these characters, politicians they've been paying off, etc., they have code words for them. Okay, so I'm saying it in a light-hearted way, but you know, if you did have sensitive information, maybe don't put the person's real name or something that's obviously evident that it's them that you're talking about, right? So just another thought for you to consider. But anyway, let me move us on. This one, I think, kind of relates to a bit your poll, Dev, around menti.com maybe, and preferences around communication. And, you know, email came up as one of the key ones people use. And essentially the question is to do with, what if there are different preferences for different stakeholders? So, you know, some prefer email, some prefer face-to-face, etc. Does that mean that we try and satisfy everyone's preference? Or to make life easier for ourselves, you know, do we stick with one or two methods of communication?
Sure. So the short answer to that is yes. Of course, you need to engage with people as they want to be engaged with. I appreciate that that might seem that it'll increase your workload. If you're managing a project and you've got so many other things to do. But I would say engagement and communications has got to be one of the top things that you're focusing on as a project manager. So you need to be spending as much time on engagement and communications as you are, let's say, planning and running the project, because they go hand in hand. That said, there are going to be certain ways of you categorizing the way people like to be informed. So, for example, if people are very visual, then you can make sure you create some colorful dashboards that get the message across in more than one way. Firstly, they get the visual messages, but then as part of a highlight report, their counterparts who want a more verbal or a more informed view can actually get that information. So it is about combining ways that you can actually send out that information. But yes, there is no getting away from it. It is hard work. It is something that will add to your workload, but to be successful, you will need to do it. Okay. Kerry, maybe you have an alternative view.
Let me move us on though. Sorry, Kerry, if I may. Sorry, just because we still have 4 questions. We have about 8 minutes to go. So
I was actually just going to couple in one of those questions with that answer as well, because they are very similar, Alim. So the one from Darren as well is talking about how can we balance our project management and stakeholder reporting. And the real answer to both of those is that when we're thinking about our engagements with our stakeholders, we're not talking about reporting. What we're actually talking about is actual communications to those stakeholders, and that will change over time given any point in time of our actual project or change initiative. So as our change initiative goes forward, our project goes forward, then our communications to that area of impact that is coming up will actually increase. And of course, stakeholders, they're fickle. Once they've got their bit, that's their end of their interest, yeah? So their interest will wane, and then it will just become an information as needed. But we can use those stakeholders as well to help us with those communications. And if you're working in that change management environment, you can bring those stakeholders on board to help you with those communications as actual change agents. Yeah, so it's not just about that reporting aspect. Stakeholder engagement is a lot more than just writing reports.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. And yeah, as you said, you covered one of the other questions around balance as well. So look, I've got 2 questions left then now, and both of them are to do with being more agile, lean, etc. So I'll ask the first one, and then we'll open it up to see if there's any other questions. So the first one being, how has the need for stakeholder engagement changed in an agile environment? And who has responsibility for this kind of analysis and comms on an agile team? So I guess the person's asking, you know, maybe the kind of methods you have illustrated may, for argument's sake, be more relevant for a longer term waterfall type project, you know, something that's maybe 6 months long or longer. Whereas in an agile environment, sprints, how do you do your stakeholder management then when it's changing and you're delivering and you know, resource constraints, etc.?
So Rebecca, I have a little thing here for you. I'm holding it up, everybody. Okay, this is actually quite new, and it is very much agile change management and how we incorporate agile and change management together. When we're talking about stakeholder engagement in agile, so agile is actually indeed a lot different because we are actually working with our stakeholders all the time. And if you are in that agile environment, your stakeholders are typically part of what it is that you are doing, either through, if it's Scrum environments, then through the use of our product owners. Stakeholders approach the product owners or indeed the Scrum Master. And if you're on the other side of the fence, such as our DSDM side, or more commonly known these days as Agile PM, we actually build that stakeholder engagement through the use of various roles within the actual project itself. So that engagement is actually already there and it's formally part of that agile way of working. So in terms of actual change of how we engage with those stakeholders, if you're really working in agile in probably the best practice mode, you shouldn't actually be feeling any kind of change at all. It should really be business as usual. But there is obviously that learning curve initially. Hi, Rebecca.
Can I just add to that question? Is
Yes,
that okay?
absolutely.
I know we've got time. So I suppose my experience is that there's an agile element of development, but then there's a very much a waterfall expectation in the legacy business. So when it comes to the stakeholder engagement, there's the engagement within the team and the directly affected team. But there's also the wider organization. So I suppose you end up still with kind of a hybrid to get those kind of key guys who are high power, high influence, but not necessarily involved in the day-to-day.
So again, we handle that in different ways. And again, a lot of this is all about educating our organizations what agile means, specifically around that stakeholder engagement, because it is actually very, very resource intensive, working with those stakeholders. So we have a sponsor as part of that agile environment, and their responsibility is to communicate and engage the stakeholders at their level. If you're in the DSDM side, so just so that everybody recognizes there's the acronym, that stands for our Dynamic Systems Development Method. Our stakeholder engagement is actually done formally at the project level, so different roles actually engage with different stakeholders, as well as at that solution development team level. So we're actually looking at our stakeholders at different levels within our organization. When you're looking at those wider stakeholder groups, so just bear in mind that principle comes back into play. Some stakeholders are best engaged by others, which means utilizing that change agent network specifically, like your line managers, your team managers, your middle level managers, to do that level of communication. Yeah, you all right with that?
Okay, thumbs up there. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yep.
Okay, so look, one last question from the chat, and then we may still have time to see if anyone has any other questions. So the question is just asking, are there any recommendations for stakeholder management for small and medium project activities? do you have some ideas about some kind of dire lean framework for small yet strategic projects? And also, is there a full-fledged framework for large programs with a list of activities in each of them to be performed? So I guess if we just focus on the kind of the lean, the agile, you know, we've touched on it already, but any recommendations for stakeholder management? I guess the book that you mentioned already, Kerry, but any other guidance, any other material?
This is not just a book, folks. This is actually a full-on training course that got launched in November.
Okay, I didn't know. That's helpful. Thank you, Kerry.
That's my gentle plug, just so that you know. That's my gentle plug. Okay.
Who's that from? Is that
course.
from APMG?
Yep, this is now part of the APMG framework certification. There's also the Certified Local Change Agent, which is another relatively new certification. So these all work hand in hand from different levels. Obviously, you have your CMI, which is your CMI change management at both foundation and practitioner level. You know, that's not so much a framework. It is actually looking at the theories and how to apply those theories. You have ProSci as well as another example that looks at the ProSci method, and it's probably, I suppose, a framework that you can in fact utilize. Lean will give you a lot of that framework in terms of engagement with our customers, because we do actually use the Lean methodologies and theories as part of our change management that we teach as well.
Okay, thanks. So we've answered all the questions. We are out of time, but let me just see if there's any other follow-up questions from anyone.
Alim, I just wanted to go back to one of the questions that was asked earlier about how can we do all of this work if you're still project managers and engaging with stakeholders and using different models and methods. Well, just to add to that, you also should have access to other comms people who can help you with the engagement. So it's not all going to be down to one person to engage with others. And you should also be looking at having some change champions who will be doing a lot of this engagement as well. So you, in your capacity, will be leading the work, but other people will be going out there and engaging as required.
Okay. Yep.
Just thought I'd finish on that.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Anything else from anyone?
So Azar, if you're looking for case studies, feel free to connect with me offline. I'm sure that Alan will more than happily pass over my details to you, and I can give you whole reference libraries of case studies to actually have a look at as well, specifically around your question.
Okay, great. And what I'll do then, so just as I'm about to thank Dev and Kerry for a great presentation, lots of material, great questions. So, thank you all. I'm going to now post the link to the Slack channel where Kerry, Dev, and other mentors live. So if you haven't joined it already, please join that Slack channel and you'll be able to reach out to Kerry directly, as I said, with Dev as well and others. So on that note, thank you all. Thanks for your questions. And we'll see you on the sessions later today and tomorrow. Thanks all.
Bye.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
See you later, guys.